All right, state your name for the record, please, sir.
Certainly. It's Christopher Corbitt, and that's Corbitt.
You remain under oath. You may proceed, Ms. Norris.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning again, Sergeant Corbitt.
Good morning.
I want to start by just clarifying one thing you were asked last week about your marital status. Are you married to anyone on this prosecution team?
No, I'm not.
Okay. All right. So were you involved in securing a wiretap in this case?
I was, yes.
What is a wiretap?
A wiretap is sort of a general term for an order that allows us to actually, law enforcement, to actually intercept the content of communication. So where with other forms of records or things, we're just seeing the numbers that are being called, with the wiretap, we actually get the content. So we can hear the voice that's being spoken, we can read text messages, things like that.
So what actually must be in place before you have the authority to monitor the content of calls or communications?
Well, obviously we have to have the authority. We have to have that order actually signed, and then that is submitted to the carrier. They provision us, they set up their equipment so they're able to send us that information in near real time, and then once all that's in place, we're able to do it.
What are the grounds for being able to get a wiretap on someone's cell phone?
That's a legal issue. Move on.
Yes, sir.
The court authorizes wiretaps. That's not a law enforcement decision. All right, proceed.
Yes, so it's not true that law enforcement can just always listen into someone's phone calls?
That's correct. We cannot.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what kind of equipment is used to do this type of monitoring?
Certainly, it is a rather complicated task, as you can imagine, but we do have software, computer-based software that assists us in listening or monitoring those communications. It displays for us the calls, it tells us the number that's calling in or being called, and it gives us some control in being able to stop and start the recordings, or enter information. We do synopsis of the calls as they're coming in to kind of generalize what that communication was about, so that when the case agents are reviewing it, they can see, kind of a written synopsis of what that call was involving.
Is there any involvement of the actual phone company or carrier?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're the ones that has to provision equipment to send us that information, and then troubleshooting along the ways if something's not happening or we're not getting everything that we're supposed to, there may be some additional contact with them.
Is the monitoring done live in real time?
Yes, it is.
And you mentioned something about stopping and starting the recordings. Do you have to go through, you and the people who are conducting the monitoring of these conversations, any kind of training on how to do the monitoring?
Yes, there is. Anyone who's going to monitor the intercept is, one, very thoroughly briefed on the case itself, so they know the persons that are involved. They know the types of evidence that we're looking for, whether it be about conspiracy or money or weapons or whatever it may be. They're aware of the types of evidence that we're seeking, and then yes, they monitor in real time. We're not allowed to listen to all conversation, so the wiretap, we have to be able to minimize or not listen to either privileged communication or stuff that's not relevant to our case. So we do have a mechanism, as I mentioned, to stop the recording, and then we kind of spot check it to see if that conversation has come back to something that we're allowed to listen to and is relevant to our case.
So you can't just listen to everything constantly from beginning to end of a conversation? That's
correct. Again, only things that are relevant to the goals of our investigation are we allowed to listen to.
Are you limited in time as to how long you can listen to something to determine if it's relevant or not before you do the minimization?
We are, and that varies a little bit by who may be party to the conversation, the experience of the monitor, and there's a lot of things that go in to exactly how long it takes us to determine whether that conversation is relevant or not. But once we make that determination, then yes, then we minimize the things that are not relevant to our case.
When you're listening, do you have to be on the lookout for code talk?
Yes, it is common. People don't speak openly or plainly.
I have an objection to this.
May I proceed? When you're monitoring these conversations, do you have to be on the lookout for code talk?
Yes. As I was saying, it's quite common that people engaged in criminal activity don't necessarily speak openly about it, and they do use either code or some other ways to communicate to kind of mask maybe the true meaning of what they're saying.
Now, when you mentioned that you have to minimize, so you're listening, you don't hear anything relevant, so you minimize, and then you can come back to the conversation to see if now they're maybe talking about something relevant to the case. How does that sound if we're listening to a wiretapped call? How do we hear that the officers are minimizing the combo?
There is, as you're listening to the recordings, there will be an audio tone that you actually hear a couple of times, and that tone is when the call is minimized and then when it returns again. But there is a definite audio marker that tells us that that has been minimized. And we're not able to hear it when it's minimized, and it's not recorded. So it doesn't exist. It's not like we could go back and listen to it later if we wanted to. Once we hit that button, that voice is no longer being recorded.
So every portion that law enforcement is listening to is recorded?
Yes, and only that portion.
And the beeping, I think it's a beeping sound, is where it's minimizing and then coming back on.
That's correct.
Which phones were tapped in this particular case?
We did Mr. Charlie Adelson's phone, the phone ending in 9223, and 2 handsets for Miss Magbanowa, the 1312 and another phone later.
When you say 1312, is that the phone number we were discussing in your earlier presentations with respect to the time period of this homicide?
Yes, that's correct.
And then there was a later phone belonging to Miss Magbanowa that was tapped as well?
That's correct.
And do you recall that phone number?
I do. It's 786-574-0338.
And which time period was that particular phone monitored?
It started the end of May, I believe May 24th of 2016 is when we began receiving audio on that phone.
Okay. And was the other phone number ending in 1312 active up until May 24th, 2016 or later?
I believe it was active later.
Who was in charge of supervising the listening? I can't talk this morning. Who was in charge of being the supervisor over the listening of these wire calls?
Well, there were a few people involved in that. There were supervisors that did the scheduling of persons who were responsible for that. I was kind of the technical supervisor in overseeing the technical side of it, making sure the equipment was operational, headphones, and all the things that it takes to actually implement the wire.
And who keeps or maintains the recordings that were created from all of the phone conversations that were monitored?
In real time, they're maintained by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They're a partner agency to us that allows us to conduct the intercept. So they maintain them during the wiretap, and then they're immediately transferred to the Tallahassee Police Department.
And at the Tallahassee Police Department, are those recordings kept in a locked cabinet that is securely secured?
Yes, they are securely maintained, yes.
And only certain officers would have access to that locked cabinet?
That's correct.
Is there anything else you think the jury needs to know about the process and the means by which law enforcement did the wiretap?
That's not a proper question.
Okay. All right, I have no further questions, Sergeant Corbitt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Garcia?
Yes, Judge. Good morning, Sergeant.
Good morning.
Whose decision was it to focus on Charlie Adelson and Catherine Magbanowa's numbers?
Well, that would have been the case investigators or the investigative team as a whole. And I didn't focus to the exclusion of other people, but they were certainly of interest in our investigation.
But these are the only 2 numbers that you guys were able to obtain Title III wire intercepts for, correct?
3 numbers.
I apologize. These are the only 2 people whose phone conversations you were monitoring, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you're aware of the bump that was used to catalyze the intercept, correct?
I am, yes.
And you'll agree with me that in the bump, somebody poses as a Latin king, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And this person approaches Donna Adelson and gives her, I don't know if it's called a ransom note or a request or just a document that's the purpose of that document is just to initiate chatter, correct?
That's correct.
Who, now, if you remember, we had conversations with regards to where Luis Rivera was staying.
That's correct. Yes.
And there was an issue where we proffered to you that he had a home address that was on his license, correct? You remember that?
Yes.
Outside of the scope, Your Honor.
You gotta tie this into the wiretap process.
Well, I'm getting there, Judge. Just give me just a little bit of,
Little quicker getting there.
a little leeway. All right, so you remember Jessica Rodriguez, right?
I do, yes.
All right, and that was the person whose residence you had listed under Rivera residence, correct?
That's correct.
Did law enforcement initiate a Title III wire intercept on Jessica Rodriguez?
We did not.
Okay. And you'll agree with me that he, according to your own testimony, had been residing there, laying his head there every night from the beginning of this conspiracy until after the conspiracy, correct?
I don't know the exact time frame that he was residing there, but certainly during the times that I was looking at, we thought that he was, yes.
And it was your testimony to this jury that he laid his head there every night, right? Pretty much?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay. And that you're aware that he was the father of multiple children with Miss Rodriguez, correct?
I'm not personally aware of that, no.
Now, let's talk about the minimization. There is an agent that makes a determination as to what calls to terminate and which calls to memorialize, correct?
That's correct.
And you weren't one of those agents, correct?
I assisted in monitoring, very limited. If someone needed a break or something like that, or we needed extra people, then I may do a small amount of monitoring, but for the most part, no.
So there are other agents. Were these FBI agents or were they local law enforcement?
I believe they were all Tallahassee Police Department members.
And the people that made the determination to minimize these calls, whatever occurred after the minimization was initiated, that's lost data, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And give me 1 second, Judge. Thank you, Sergeant Corbitt. No further questions.
Hey, Bennett.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Everybody's talking really fast right now. So again, we have wiretaps set up for Charles Adelson, right?
That's correct, yes.
Catherine Magbanwa.
Yes,
You work at TPD.
I do.
The theory of the case is that the Adelsons are behind this.
That is, yes.
Not one wiretap on any Adelson. Let me correct that. Wendy Adelson, wiretap.
No,
Harvey Adelson.
no,
Don Adelson.
no,
Jessica Rodriguez.
no.
This could have been done.
I don't know that I can speak to whether the authority existed or not for anyone else.
One could say it would have been cumbersome, it would have been a lot of work, but we're talking about multiple law enforcement agencies, right?
Yes, and I don't know that cumbersome is certainly not the reason to do or not do an investigative task here, but I cannot speak again to the authority or the decision on whose phones were going to be intercepted.
So you can't tell this jury why Wendy Adelson's phone was not tapped.
That's correct.
So we don't know who she was contacting.
We do know who she was contacting. We have phone records, we have communication records. We just don't have the content of those communications.
You have phone records for these people in 2016?
For some, yes.
You don't have them for Catherine Magbanwa?
In 2016,
Call detail records?
yes, we do.
We can go sidebar, Judge? Sergeant, do you know the dates of what's been referred to as the bump?
I don't recall the specific date, but I know that was in the initial part of our intercept.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the wiretaps begin early April of 2016.
They do.
Do you have any call detail records beginning in April of 2016 and going through the time of the wiretap?
We do, yes.
For who?
I could not tell you specifically off the top of my head, and let me clarify that part of the wiretap also includes delivering to us basically real-time call detail records. So as I mentioned, in addition to just hearing the voice, we're actually seeing the numbers that are being dialed. So we have a record of that. So even if we don't have communication or something else, we still know who is attempting to call who as a process of receiving that real-time data. We receive that real-time information for other people involved in the investigation, and again, as well as collecting historical call detail records for some persons.
Sergeant Corbitt, we'll come back to that because those are your records. Do you have call detail records for Catherine Magbanwa during the time of the bump?
During the time of the bump, we were on a live intercept for her, so we do not have any historical records for that time. The other phone that I mentioned did not come into service until after the bump.
Sergeant, the 1312 number. Now, this is the phone that she had 2014, 2015, 2016.
That's correct.
You do not have call detail records from the service provider for April, May, and June during the time of the wiretap, do you?
We do, and I'm sorry if I'm not clear, but we receive, call detail records include the date and time of a transaction, the duration, the calling parties, and location information, the cell sites being utilized. So we can get that information historically, or we can get that information in real time. We call that a pin register or trap trace. And that is, again, the carrier in real time is delivering us those exact same historical call detail records, but we're getting them in real time. So we're, again, able to see the date and time of a transaction, who's calling who, and the cell sites that are utilized. So while we don't have historical records, we didn't get something going back in the past, we didn't need to because we were getting that exact same information in real time.
Perfect. So let's now go over to Sigfredo Garcia. No wiretap for him, right?
That's correct.
So we don't have any call detail records either from the service provider or what you just explained to the jury, right?
I believe there was a pin register and trap trace on his number at the time.
Believe means you're not sure, right?
I could look and be certain, but we did obtain records for his handset, and we were aware of who he was communicating with.
So now you are sure?
I would want to look and be certain the dates of that, but yes.
The answer for right now is you're not sure whether you have it or not, right? The
Correct.
answer right now.
Correct.
To clarify, we don't have any wiretap of Wendy Adelson, Harvey Adelson, Donna Adelson,
Mr. DeCotte, you have something new?
Jessica Rodriguez, no wiretap, right?
Correct.
Let's talk about the wiretaps themselves. You said that law enforcement are sitting in front of a phone, a terminal. They start it, they stop it, right?
It's computer screen, but yes.
So for the recording to start, there has to be someone to be there to say, well, we're going to start recording this one.
There has to be someone actively monitoring. The recording will begin as long as there's someone actually signed in and attending to the screen. As long as that's there, then the recording will start, and it's their obligation to end recording when it's not relevant, or if it's not relevant.
And some of this was being done outside of the Tallahassee Police Department, right?
No.
Florida Department of Law Enforcement wasn't involved?
They were involved. Again, they were the conduit or the mechanism for our connection to the carrier, but that information was delivered to the Tallahassee Police Department, and the point that it was actually heard or listened to was only within the Tallahassee Police Department.
All right, so let's come back to this. There's got to be a human being sitting there, pressing start for it to be recorded, right?
They don't necessarily have to press start to initiate the recording. As long as they're present and logged in, then the recording will begin.
And if somebody is not logged in or present, then we won't have a recording of it, right?
That's correct.
Now, it goes a step further than that, because there can be an officer that's there, and they deem something not relevant, right?
Correct.
And we wouldn't have a recording of that.
As long as they minimize that portion of the conversation, then no, we would not have record of that.
Well, they could deem the entire call not relevant as well, too, right?
They could. I'm certainly not aware of that happening.
Now, it wasn't just a small team of people that were monitoring these calls. There was a lot of people at Tallahassee Police Department, a lot of law enforcement that were involved in this, right?
That's correct, yes.
Working throughout the day, throughout the night.
Correct.
People need to take food breaks, take bathroom breaks. Could have been left unattended. We could be missing calls, right?
No. Again, the scheduling of officers took into account all of that, and there were people to provide relief or breaks, something that I did myself. If someone needed to be away from the terminal, then someone else could log in and take that. Or if it's really slow, one person could monitor multiple lines. So there's not a reason that we shouldn't have at least attempted to listen to calls.
At the end of the day, though, it's within the discretion of people at Tallahassee Police Department of what's recorded and what's not, right?
Yes.
Who monitors you?
The supervisors and the case agents.
outside of Tallahassee Police Department? Who monitors this whole process?
The state attorney's office?
This state attorney's office?
Yes.
These prosecutors?
Yes.
You were asked some questions about people talking in code. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
And how the people wouldn't want to talk openly over the phone and that they would use code to avoid sounding guilty, right?
Sometimes, yes.
Wouldn't you agree with me that the logical step would be to just not use phones?
It would be.
Or to use encrypted communication like WhatsApp?
It would be, yes.
None of what you have here through these wiretaps involves non-electronic communication, right?
Correct.
Doesn't include FaceTimes.
Correct.
Doesn't include WhatsApp.
Correct.
Or any other encrypted forms of communication.
That's correct.
One brief moment, Your Honor.
You bet.
Sergeant, last few questions. The wiretaps begin early April. They end mid-June.
Early June, yes.
You have, and correct me if I'm wrong, 359 recorded phone calls?
I believe we probably have more than that. I don't know the exact number.
Is it around that number? Give or take 50?
Well, between the 3 intercepts, it could be around that number.
And given the fact that Catherine McBanwell was one of the only 2 people that was being recorded on those wiretaps, you agree with me that it's a lot of her phone calls that are being recorded?
Well, the number of phone calls being recorded would be directly relative to how frequently someone is on the phone. If they're communicating a lot, then there would be a lot more recordings than if they were not. But it doesn't, we don't have an effect on how many are actually made.
My question is a lot simpler than that. You have the recordings, right?
We do, yes.
A lot of them are of Catherine, right?
They are, yes.
Before you do these wiretaps, you don't send notification to people that you're recording, do you?
We do not.
They don't know they're being recorded, right?
Correct.
And this is all after what's been termed the bump?
Before and after, yes.
Of those hundreds of phone calls, not once does Catherine McBanwell talk about being involved in the murder of Dan Markel, does she?
I think others would be better to speak about the content of the communications and what the meaning behind those might be.
Nothing further.
Redirect.
You were asked some questions about who oversees law enforcement, and you mentioned the state attorney's office is involved, and it's also oversaw by a court, correct?
That's correct. There is, the judge ultimately oversees, there are periodic reportings that are made to the judge on a 10-day or
Relevance.
Overruled.
Yes, sir.
or a different incremental time. There is a report made to the judge so that the judge may see the types of communications that are being intercepted, that we are in fact getting communications that are relevant to the investigation, and then the judge continues to authorize that continued interception.
And the minimization you were asked about is not a choice of law enforcement. It is, you are required to do that by the court order authorizing the tap.
That's correct, yes.
Mr. DeCoste asked you about not having any wiretaps on the Adelsons. You did have a wiretap on an Adelson family member,
We did, yes.
Charles Adelson.
That's correct.
With respect to whose phone you're tapping, if you have a wiretap on Catherine McBanwell's phone, for example, which you did in this case, would that capture any calls that she made to Charles Adelson?
It would, yes.
Any calls that she made to Sigfredo Garcia?
It would, yes.
Or any other people that she calls on that particular phone number?
That's correct.
Same for Charles Adelson. If he were to call Donna Adelson, would you be able to monitor that phone call?
We would, yes.
And if vice versa, Donna Adelson or Harvey Adelson or Wendy Adelson called him, you would be able to monitor that conversation as well.
That's correct.
Can you go back in time and do a wiretap?
No.
Okay. So you have to have everything in place to monitor calls in the future.
That's correct, yes.
So we can't go back to June or July 2014 to listen to content of conversations.
No, we can't.
And what is the purpose? I know you were mentioning shifts. My understanding, based on what you just testified to, was these calls are being monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by someone.
Correct, yes.
And that way you can make sure everything is monitored, exculpatory or inculpatory.
Correct.
Great, thank you, Sergeant Corbitt. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
All right, hey, juror, I have a question of this witness on this topic. All right, you can step down. All right, next witness.
State called Sherrie Bennett.
We're recalling it.
Please, clerk, can be sworn, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat. Slide it microphone, please.
Please say and spell your name.
Investigator Sherrie Bennett, Sherrie Bennett.
And how are you employed?
I'm an investigator with the Tallahassee Police Department.
How long have you been with TPD?
11 years.
Did you have any role in reference to the wiretap that was conducted in reference to the case that we're here about?
Yes, I did.
What was your role in reference to the wiretap?
I was to secure all documents and evidence in the case.
All right, so we heard about the process that's used for collecting the data from a wiretap, which the data is mainly phone calls, correct?
That's correct.
And once the data is collected, how is it stored? Is it on a disk, a thumb drive, a hard drive?
It was provided to me on a disc.
All right, and were you the person that was designated to be the custodian or like the guardian of that data?
Yes, I was.
All right, where were the disks kept?
I have a filing cabinet in my office.
All right, is the filing cabinet locked?
Yes, it is.
And your office is at the Tallahassee Police Department?
Yes, it is.
Who else had access to the filing cabinet?
No one.
All right, have you had an opportunity to review the disk States Exhibit 138?
Yes, I have.
Does States 138 contain fair and accurate, complete copies of calls that were made and stored by you as the custodian of these wiretap recordings?
Yes, it was.
All right, no further questions.
Proceed.
No questions for Mr. Garcia.
Back battle.
No questions.
All right. You can step down. Call your next witness.
State calls Pat Sanford.
You face the clerk and be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony given in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Sir, please introduce yourself and spell your name.
Special Agent Patrick Sanford, Patrick Sanford.
How are you employed?
I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
How long have you been so employed?
A little over 20 years.
All right, and were you involved in the investigation regarding the death of Dan Markel?
Yes, I was.
What was your role in reference to that investigation?
Starting out, I was just assisting with covering leads, chasing down out-of-town leads, and then became a partner, co-investigator on the case. I was just the FBI's lead investigator eventually.
All right, so originally you were assisting. Who were you assisting?
Tallahassee Police Department.
Okay, and eventually you kind of became equal partners with, I guess, Detective Isom with the Tallahassee Police Department?
That's correct.
All right. And was it unusual? Is there anything unusual about the FBI assisting local law enforcement?
No, that's part of our duties.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about what, if any, efforts you made to identify any connection between Luis Rivera and Charlie Adelson?
Yes, we started out, once we identified Mr. Rivera, I did a thorough, extensive background, I should say, on all of his past history, where his former addresses that he lived at, former phone numbers that he had. Once we did that, we already had all the phone numbers from Mr. Adelson. And we compared all those numbers to try to cross-reference and scrub, basically is what we call it, scrubbing our databases to see if there's any links whatsoever between the two of them, any phone calls, any way they would have crossed paths or anything like that.
And with what result?
There was negative results. There was no contacts whatsoever between the two of them.
Are you familiar with the federal RICO investigation that included a wiretap on Mr. Rivera's phone?
Yes, I am.
And that was a separate investigation from the murder investigation, correct?
That's correct. That was conducted down in Miami.
All right, but since you had a wiretap on Mr. Rivera's phone, was that something that was looked at to see were there any communications on that wiretap which suggested that Mr. Rivera was in communication with Mr. Adelson?
Yes, I did. I communicated with the agents down in South Florida and had them scrub their databases for any communications with Mr. Adelson. Also, just compared any communications that they had with his co-defendants also, and tried to compare with any of our phone numbers that we had. We also took the phone numbers subscriber list basically from their case. They provided it to me, and I provided it to TPD to compare with all of the phone numbers that we had involving this case.
Okay, and I want to talk about Mr. Rivera's proffer in a moment. Were you present for some meetings with Mr. Rivera?
Yes, I was.
Okay, but I apologize for jumping around a little bit. First, I want to approach with states 85 and 86. Did you have contact with a witness by the name of Shadrick Nobles?
Yes, we did.
And as part of that contact, was Mr. Nobles presented with some photographic lineups containing photos of both Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera?
Yes, he was.
All right, and I want you to take a look at those exhibits and see if those are the actual lineups that were shown to the witness, Mr. Nobles.
That one was of Mr. Rivera.
If you'll just leave them out, because I'm going to publish them.
I don't know how to do it. I'm afraid to touch that thing. If you move it wrong, it starts flashing disconnected, and I'm not going to be responsible for that.
And what about states 86?
Yes, that's the one of Mr. Garcia.
All right, Judge, at this time, I'd ask to move into evidence states 85 and 86.
Any objection?
No, Judge.
No, Your Honor.
Will be admitted. You may.
Can you please describe the procedure for showing a lineup to a witness as it was done in this case with Mr. Nobles?
We just provided him each one of the photographs individually and told him that the subject that he was talking about may or may not be in this photo lineup. Showed him one picture at a time, and then turned the photo over and let him see the next photo.
And was Mr. Nobles able to identify anyone in this lineup?
Yes, he identified Mr. Rivera.
Mr. Rivera was number 3 in the lineup?
That's correct. He also initialed the bottom of the picture.
Mr. Nobles' initials indicating that was one of the suspects he identified?
That's correct.
All right, and what about in reference to Mr. Garcia? Was the same procedure used there?
That is correct. Yes, he was.
Mr. Garcia?
Yes, it is.
No initials?
That's correct.
The other subjects in the lineup? Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, you mentioned being present at Mr. Rivera's proffer. Were you present at the September 30th, 2016 meeting?
Yes, I was.
And who else was present at that meeting?
Investigator Isom, Mr. Rivera, Mr. Rivera's attorney, Mr. Collins.
Which Mr. Collins? We got a couple of those if you know.
I believe it was the older one.
Okay, David Collins?
David Collins,
All
correct.
right. And do you have any recollection of a procedure where information was passing back and forth between Mr. Rivera and law enforcement through the lawyer, Mr. Collins?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Do you have any recollection of a procedure that was used at that meeting whereby information was traveling from law enforcement back and forth to Mr. Rivera with the lawyer being used as a go-between?
No.
So what was the procedure at the meeting that you were present for?
We just sat down to do an interview with him and just asked him to basically tell us what happened. It was basically a fact-finding mission for us.
All right. And during the meeting that you were present at, so you directly had contact with Mr. Rivera at the first meeting you were present at?
That's correct.
All right. And were you permitted to ask Mr. Rivera questions?
Yes, we were.
All right. And can you describe for the jury a little bit about what types of questions you would ask in a proffer like that?
It's basically very open-ended questions. We're trying to gauge his truthfulness. So we ask him basically, what happened, where were you, who told you, things like that. So it's very open-ended. We don't want to feed him information. We don't want him to, we don't want to lead him at all. Don't want him to know what we know. That way we can verify whether he's telling us the truth or not.
And during the time that you were present at the meeting on 9/30/16, did anybody in your presence feed Mr. Rivera any information or try to lead or correct Mr. Rivera?
Absolutely not. It was actually the opposite.
And was there specifically some things that Mr. Rivera was not correct about?
That's correct.
And what was that?
One thing was where he talked about getting a ticket. We knew he had a ticket on the way up the first trip. He told us that he got a ticket on the second trip in the Toyota Prius, which we knew was not correct. But it was his memory, and that's what we want him to do, is tell us what he remembers, not what we know what happened. We want him to tell us what he thinks.
So you didn't make any effort to correct him for fear that it would be like you're trying to shape his testimony?
That's correct.
All right. And did you also participate in the ride around Tallahassee that was done that same day where Mr. Rivera was pointing out different routes that they took when they were up here?
That's correct, I did.
Okay, what do you remember about that?
We basically did the same thing. We let him tell us where to go, tried to let him remember certain things and landmarks to tell us which way to go, which way to end up, things like that. So we just sat back and kind of let him tell us what he did on those days and how he knew that.
All right, and as part of that, did you ride around the area of the crime scene, and he pointed out some parks near the crime scene, that sort of thing?
That's correct.
Okay, and then later there was another ride around, or more than one ride around looking for the gun, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, but that was not done on the 9/30/16 date?
No, I don't believe so.
All right.
No.
And then did you also participate in a recorded interview with Mr. Rivera on October 4th of 2016?
That's correct.
All right, and what was the procedure used in that interview? Was it any different from the way you handled the 9/30/16 interview?
No, basically the same thing. We let him tell us what happened.
All right, and was Mr. Rivera fed or led with information at all by any parties at that 10/4/16 meeting?
Absolutely not.
And was Mr. Rivera's testimony inconsistent in some way from the 10/4/16, at the 10/4/16 from the 9/30/16?
No, it was very consistent.
Did you learn anything new? I mean, this proffer is done what, 2 years after the murder?
That's
More
correct.
than 2 years.
A little over.
Was there anything new that you learned from Mr. Rivera that law enforcement had not already known or was able to corroborate independently from the information you already had?
Yes.
What was that?
One was where he told us a story about how the gun went off. Mr. Garcia had the gun go off in the vehicle and shot through the vehicle and actually disabled the gas line on the vehicle.
All right, so that was something you had not known previously?
No, we had information their car broke down, but we didn't know why it broke down.
Okay, and as a result, was law enforcement sent out to see if, in fact, there was a hole in the floorboard of the Prius?
That's correct.
And there was?
There was.
Okay. Anything else? What about following Mr. Markel to the daycare on the day of the homicide? Did you know about that already?
No, the only thing we did know was there was what appeared to be a green Prius behind him on some bank surveillance footage. That was the only thing that I had at the time that indicated they followed him to the daycare.
But at the time, was law enforcement aware of a witness by the name of Keith Leland at the daycare who actually saw a green Prius?
No, was not aware of him.
All right. Well, what about the stapled money?
He told us about the money that he received for the actual committing the crime was stapled, and we didn't have any indication of that from anybody at that point.
All right, and was there anything significant to you at that time that you first heard that about the stapling?
Anything significant about it?
I mean, was the witness June Umchinda, had that witness been developed at the time Mr. Rivera gave his statement?
No, she had not been.
So at the time that Mr. Rivera told you his money was stapled, you didn't know that Mr. Adelson makes a practice of stapling his money?
That's correct. That was new information to us.
I want to ask you about the efforts to look for the gun. We've touched on that. What role did you have in the efforts to try to locate the murder weapon in this case?
We took Mr. Rivera out of the jail and drove him down the route that he had taken on the way back. We took him down there twice looking for the gun, and finally found a bridge that he believed looked very similar and he thought was probably the bridge. After that, I assembled a team of what we call evidence response team members.
Where was that bridge?
It was in Tampa, outside of Tampa.
Okay.
I requested assistance from our Tampa division, from their evidence response team. When we went to that location, it was off the I-75 right at the river. We went down and cleared all the brush, used weed eaters, trimmers, and metal detectors, and looked all through the brush. Didn't find it that day. I came back with a dive team after that because there's water further away from the road where the gun could have made it into the river. So I came back with a dive team that we have out of our Miami division, brought them there, and we did a cordoned off, basically grid search in the river.
And how much time had passed between the time that, according to Mr. Rivera, the gun was deposited there and the time that you were looking for it?
Oh, over 2 years.
Okay, and did you find the gun?
No, we did not.
All right, and this location that you spent a lot of time looking at, was it like Mr. Rivera took you right there, or was there some confusion about exactly where it could have been?
Yeah, there was confusion. The first trip down, he saw several bridges that were similar, but he wasn't quite sure. And then that one he thought it was right at the first trip. That particular river he thought was one that preceded the one he threw it off on. He kept looking for the next one. So he wasn't real sure the first trip. We went back the second time, and he looked at the guardrails. There might have been some changes to the location since he threw it over, like the guardrail might be missing now. But there was definitely some confusion. He wasn't positive.
You said since he threw it over. Who's the he in that sentence?
Sorry, since Mr. Garcia.
All right, so Rivera was never inconsistent about who threw the gun?
No, he was not.
We've learned about a black Lexus that Ms. McBanowa was driving. Do you have any knowledge of that black Lexus?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us about the surveillance efforts that were made on Ms. McBanowa around the time of, I have it, November of 15 to May of 15?
We had
Objection, hearsay.
But let's hear the question. Let's ask a little more specific question.
What surveillance efforts were being made on Catherine McBanoa between November of 15 and May of 15?
Sustained to the extent he's reporting what somebody else has told him.
Okay. Do you have any personal observations that occurred during that time?
Yes, I did.
All right. Could you tell us about those, please?
We had video surveillance on her residence at that time.
And that's something that you reviewed?
It is.
And was Ms. McBanoa observed during that time frame driving the black Lexus?
Yes, she was.
Okay. And was Ms. McBanoa driving the black Lexus at the time of her arrest?
Objection, best evidence, and proper opinion.
Overruled.
Was Ms. McBanoa driving the black Lexus at the time of her arrest?
Yes, she was.
All right. I want to talk about the undercover operation, or what's been referred to as the bump. I want to draw your attention to April 19th, 2016. Could you just briefly explain for the jury the investigative strategy for doing this type of undercover operation?
Sure. We had good evidence that on who committed the crime. We also had good evidence on...
Objection and proper characterization of the evidence.
Sustained.
Was the purpose of the investigation or the undercover operation to evidence who's involved in the conspiracy and what each person's role in the conspiracy?
That's correct.
Okay. And so could you just kind of tell the jury what the idea was, how it was going to go down?
We wanted to bring an undercover in who pretended to be a gang member who was an associate of Mr. Rivera. We knew that Mr. Rivera was in jail. We knew that Mr. Rivera was having financial issues, and we wanted to insert somebody into the equation to get people talking again, because it had been over a year since the crime was committed, and we knew that they probably weren't talking about it anymore. So we wanted to try to gather evidence on who was actually responsible for creating the crime and committing the crime. So we wanted to insert that information in there and have them start talking and communicating again.
And what was the undercover supposed to do?
He was supposed to approach Mrs. Adelson and provide her with a flyer, basically, that just had information about the murder. It was basically a news article, and just basically tell her that he was friends with who he called Tato, which was Mr. Rivera, and that he knew everything, and that he wanted her to help him out financially. He was hurting financially and wanted the family to help him out financially.
Were you present during this, what we're calling the bump, the contact between the undercover and Mrs. Adelson?
That's correct, I was.
All right. Did you see the flyer that the undercover handed to Mrs. Adelson?
Yes, I did.
Could you describe it for the jury, please?
Objection, hearsay, best evidence.
Overruled.
It was a news article that we printed out off the internet.
Did it have a photograph of Mr. Markel?
It did.
Okay. And what else? Was there anything handwritten on the news article?
There was. We wrote the number $5,000 and a phone number of the undercover agent.
Do you have that phone number with you? You could tell it to us?
I do. It's 305-712-6570, I believe.
And was that going to be a number that law enforcement would monitor if anyone called it?
It was. It was an FBI number that we had established.
All right, and we have already watched the video of the bump itself. Were you able to listen in real time as law enforcement to the calls that succeeded that interaction between the undercover and Ms. Adelson?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And I want to draw your attention to State's Exhibit 138. Have you had an opportunity to review the disc, State's 138?
Yes.
Does State's 138 contain fair and accurate calls that were captured on that wire?
It does.
Judge, at this time, I'd ask to move an evidence, State's 138.
Subject to my prior ruling.
Yes,
Is there
sir.
any additional objection?
Nothing additional, Your Honor.
All right.
All right, so who calls who first? I guess we give the note to Donna. What does she do?
She immediately stuffs it in her pouch without looking at it and goes across the street, retrieves her grandkids, and then goes back to her condominium. Shortly thereafter, I think a few minutes after arriving back at her condo, she calls Charlie Adelson.
All right, and when you say she retrieves her grandkids, are those Mr. Markel's two sons?
That's correct.
Okay, so she was retrieving them from where?
From the school, which is directly across the street from her condominium.
All right, and then returned to her condominium and talked to Mr. Adelson. When she talked to Charlie Adelson, we watched the video, as I mentioned, and we see where the undercover says the name Katie. You're taking care of Katie and Tudo, right?
That's correct.
When Mrs. Adelson talks to Charlie Adelson, does she say the name Katie
Objection.
to Charlie?
Objection.
Okay. Okay, who does Charlie call after he talks to his mother?
He calls Katie Magmama.
All right, and as that states, I want to, at this time, publish call number D, if I could get some assistance with that. Permission to hand out call D.
You mind? Let me give them an instruction though first. Hold on a second. I'm sorry, do you need a break? You need a break. All right, we'll take 15 minutes. Sorry, I kind of lost track of time. Either side need it, thank you.
Yes, Your Honor, appropriate. It seems like the appropriate time to do it. In the event that the government is going to ask this witness for any opinions about any of these phone calls, we would object. We'd have a standing objection to the proper opinion.
You'll just have to object as it occurs. I'm not sure what that would apply to. I do intend to give the jury the instruction on transcripts. I assume the defense would seek that.
Yes, Judge.
Yes, Your Honor.
Use the standard instruction. We'll be in recess 15 minutes.